Welcome virtually to the Council of the Americas for our program today on the upcoming Uruguay elections and what to anticipate, what comes next. We have an all-star panel for you this morning of real stars, and I'm going to introduce them in just a second. But before we do that, let me introduce myself. I'm Eric Farnsworth. I head the Washington office of the Council, and it's a great privilege to have the opportunity to moderate this conversation for all of you today. Uruguay is a special country, as all of you know, democratic, long-standing traditions of democracy, open markets, the rule of law, prosperous, and it punches above its weight routinely in international affairs. Council of the Americas has had a special relationship with Uruguay for a long time. We just gave the gold insignia to the outgoing president, Lacalle Pou, in Washington for the America Society 2 years ago. We devoted a special edition of America's Quarterly to Uruguay several issues ago. I myself have written on Uruguay several times, and indeed we are promoting the idea that Uruguay is a wonderful candidate for enhanced trade and investment relations with the United States and with Asia through the CPTPP, the Comprehensive Partnership for Regional Trade that indeed replaced the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and that train is moving as well. It's a really creative and interesting idea. Uruguay is a jewel tucked between two giants, and so we want to hear a little bit about that today. Before I introduce our speakers, our panelists, I do want to give a special shout out to both ambassadors, the U.S. ambassador to Uruguay, Heidi Fulton, who's a good friend, and she has indicated her ability and interest in joining this morning, and the Uruguayan ambassador here in Washington, Andres Duran. Both are great friends and wonderful representatives of their respective countries and really have done quite a lot to not just manage, but build the relationship between our two great countries. So we welcome both of them and their staffs as well. Uruguayans go to the polls on October 27th. If there is no person who gets a majority of the votes, there will be a runoff on November 24th if necessary. There are currently 11 candidates, but 3 are in the lead, and we're going to hear about them very soon. But the person who's currently leading is the opposition candidate, candidate Orsi, with the left-wing broad front. The candidate of the government coalition, Álvaro Delgado, is the current chief of staff to the outgoing president, Lacalle Pou, and the third leading candidate is lawyer and media personality Andrés Ojeda. The polls are shifting, and the projections are shifting as well. They're also, Uruguayans are looking at 2 very important referendum questions on, public security and also on social security. To talk to us this morning, we have 3 unbelievably qualified speakers. All 3 are PhDs. And all 3 come to these issues with great experience and great expertise. Our first panelist is Nicolás Saldías. Nick is the senior analyst for Latin America and the Caribbean at the Economist Intelligence Unit. He specializes in political and economic forecasting for Argentina, Chile, and Uruguay. Since 2021, he's led the EIU's Democracy Index for the Latin America and Caribbean region. His PhD is in political science from the University of Toronto, which he completed in 2021. Diego Pereira is JP Morgan's chief economist for South America, excluding Brazil. He joined JP Morgan in 2011, covering Southern Cone macroeconomics. He later moved to the Emerging Markets Strategy Group, focusing on Latin American foreign exchange strategy in 2013. In 2016, his role expanded after he was appointed chief economist for the Southern Cone. His PhD and also his MSc in economics are from UPF in Spain. And if I didn't mention it already, he is Uruguayan. And so we're delighted, Diego, to have you join us as well. And our third panelist is Samar Maziad, and Dr. Maziad is vice president and senior analyst at Moody's Sovereign Risk Group in New York. She's lead credit risk analyst for a portfolio of Latin American sovereigns and multilateral development banks. Prior to joining Moody's, she was senior economist at the IMF, which you may have heard of, the International Monetary Fund, where she covered a wide range of macroeconomic and financial stability issues in emerging markets, including not just Latin America, but also China. Samar is a PhD in economics from the University of St. Andrews in the United Kingdom. We welcome all of you, and we are just delighted that we've been able to attract such an all-star panel to join us today to talk about Uruguay, the elections, and what to anticipate. Let's go first to Nick Saldías. Nick, set the table for us. Give us a sense of how the elections are shaping up right now. They're only a couple of weeks away. How do they look, and what are the primary issues from your perspective that are driving the vote, and what can we anticipate?
Well, thanks, Eric, and thanks for the council for inviting me. It's a very interesting election because all the indications should suggest that the incumbent party should be leading the polls and should glide to victory in some ways. The economy is doing quite well. It's growing around 3% a year this year. Real salaries are increasing, employment is up, consumer confidence indices are positive. And Lakashepo, who's the current president, is actually quite popular. His approval rating is at 50%. And you would expect that the current candidate for the Partido Nacional, which is the governing party, Álvaro Delgado, would be doing better in the polls, but he's not. He hasn't been able to convince enough voters, that is, to give him a convincing lead in the polls, especially when it comes to within the dynamics within the coalition, which also include other parties. And as you stated, there's Andrés Ojeda, who is a young, vibrant candidate who the polls have shown has increased in his support in recent weeks, actually. And trend lines suggest that if this continues, he could potentially be the candidate for the coalition in the second round. So this is a Black Swan event. I don't think that will happen, but it's something to pay attention to because it would change the dynamics of the race completely in the second round. Yamandú Orsi, who is the candidate for the Frente Amplio, he has maintained his lead at around 44% in the polls. It's a high ceiling and it's a high ceiling for him. He has not been able to go higher than that. The Frente Amplio has a very strong level of support in the population, especially amongst the left, because it consolidates all left-wing parties. The challenge that he faces is expanding his base outside of that 44%, which is proving to be quite difficult. Part of the reason why Orsi is unable to do so or hasn't been able to do so far is because he hasn't been very outward in terms of his interviews. He has been shy from articulating his policy preferences. The party is kind of unsure where it's going to be going in terms of its policies. And so voters are a bit skeptical of Orsi and what his party represents as well. So it's a continuity versus change election. And it seems that continuity is likely to win. That's our forecast. Delgado is seen as a very competent leader. He's well spoken and he has very clear policy preferences, which stands in contrast to Orsi. But the real thing that has happened in this election and what dominates the election is actually not so much a presidential race, but the plebiscite for the pension reform. This is the most significant reform that Uruguay has faced in terms of its economic and political impacts. So basically, the reform would bring down the retirement age from 65 to 60. It would tie the minimum pension to the minimum salary, and it would also eliminate the private pension pillar of the pension system, which has about $23 billion worth of savings. This would massively increase the deficit because it would be a constitutional reform, meaning that the government can't not implement these reforms. So tying the minimum salary to the minimum wage, sorry, the minimum pension to the minimum salary would increase spending by over $1 billion potentially. And it's unsure how that will be financed. Uruguay getting rid of its private pension pillar would also induce significant legal and reputational costs for the country that I'm sure my colleagues will talk about in terms of its investment grade status. And it would also, more importantly, from a political angle, completely dominate politics. It would be akin to like a Brexit, I feel like. If it passes, the second round campaigning between Orsi and whoever the candidate may be, Delgado or Ojeda, it will dominate everything. It will just crowd out all other issues in the election, and it will be the most dominant issue. And the primary problem that will be facing these candidates is how to square their own policy preferences with the fact that they have this massive new liability that is unsure. That no one really knows how it's going to be paid for. So that would be the dominant problem that the campaign faces in the second round, and also for the next subsequent years. Uruguayan politics will be dominated by how to address this new pension reform, counter reform, you could say. Finally, I would say that the issue that Uruguay faces as well that voters are concerned about is crime. Crime is a major issue in Uruguay. Although Uruguay perceives itself as one of the more safer countries in the region, it actually has a very high level of homicides. Uruguay's homicide rate is 111 per 100,000, which is double the US rate or double the Chilean rate. And it's rising and it's creating problems because Uruguay has not actually invested enough in dealing with this problem. And so one of the major challenges I feel like for the next government is dealing with crime. But with all the bandwidth, if the plebiscite is passed, which we don't think will happen, by the way, but if it is passed, it will mean that the next government will not be able to adequately address that very significant issue. And that could have downstream political effects for Uruguay going into the future.
Yeah, those are some really important points. And, everybody seems to be faced with increasing crime these days across the region. Uruguay largely escaped that, but seems not to at this point. And I think some of your writings have indicated that some of that at least is related to the increasing drug trade that Uruguay is facing. And it's a real threat to democracy around the region. Diego, we're going to come to you. Nick teased out the pension reform and some of the implications, if it passes, that could have for Uruguay. But let's take a wider aperture for just the moment. How's the country doing economically and financially? How are you seeing it in the current environment as we go into the election?
Oh, sure. Thank you very much, Eric, for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to participate in these sort of conversations, and extremely well timed, by the way. So let me start by addressing that. I mean, first of all, always bear in mind, the probability of going into a runoff, even from the start of the campaign, is always assessed as very high. So therefore, when thinking about the programs, economic and financial programs of the different sort of political parties, they tend to be, a little bit relaxed going into in terms of details going into the first round, and usually it's in those weeks prior to the runoff in which we have a little bit more of a granular information on which are their main ideas. But to what you both guys already have expressed, in Uruguay, we have a country in which pendular behavior, these sort of refundational policies are absent. And we have had that in prior years when we moved from the center left into the central right coalition, and will likely be the case if we turn again into the center left. Many options, as you pointed out, but the most likely scenario is to have a runoff setting between the center-right coalition or center to the right vis-a-vis the center to the left coalition that is represented by a sole political party, Frente Amplio. Look, when thinking about the incumbent, is basically about the profundization of the reforms implemented in these 5 years. I always put emphasis on the fact that this administration took office days before the first case of COVID in the country. So therefore, when you think about 5 years, actually, the term for implementing the reforms in order to the reforms to have an impact on the median voter has been much less than 5 years. Actually, you could think of 3 years and a half. And so it's more about continuity in this regard, the profundization of the reforms that we have seen. If the center left is the one, Orsi is a presidential candidate coming to office, we already know his Minister of Finance, Gabriel Odone, a very serious and respected economist in Uruguay. I would say he's embracing the fiscal order, which was also true with the prior Frente Amplio administrations, but embracing the fiscal order, and I would expect a lot of continuity, if you want, in regards to the main institutions that were built or reformed during this administration. And one point that we should not be foreign, I'm not going to discuss, to your advisor, I'm not going to discuss the potential implications of the approval of the pension plebiscite, but it's worth noting that all presidential candidates have been verbal against the approval of the pension reform. Even though in the case of Orsi, some sectors of the Frente Amplio had been and are in favor of its approval. So this calls, and this is very important. This is very important because at the end of the day, this goes into this idea that the respect for institutions and for the fiscal order at the end of the day, and putting aside the campaign noise, prevails. And this is very important to emphasize. Now, there are two options, and therefore I think it's important to position on where are we right now, and maybe comparing to the prior 5 years to the Lacalle administration. So let me very briefly talk about growth, inflation, and fiscal. Growth. If I take the average growth rate, GDP growth rate, 2021, 2024, basically gives you 3.3 average per year. If I had to compare that to the period 2016, 2019, gives you an annualized average growth per year of 0.7%. So a number of the reforms implemented by this administration helped GDP growth, and I'm not taking into consideration, if you look at the windows that I compared, I didn't take into consideration the fall during the COVID and the recovery. That's why I started, or I named 2021, 2024, okay? Second, and because I want to prove that there's a lot of continuity, one of the factors that actually have helped Uruguay to grow above its potential in the last 3 years has been an investment decision that was taken in the prior administration in regards to a paper pulp mill and the logistics around it. So continuity. Inflation, and in here we have had something very important. And from a market standpoint, I think I would say this has been the most important reform, together with the fiscal institutions created by, on the monetary policy side, very important because it was a complete revamp of the monetary policy template. And we have seen that having an effect on inflation. And when you look, for example, at the behavior of inflation in Uruguay, pre-reform of the policy template and post-reform, I mean, just to compare 2014, 2019, average inflation in Uruguay, 6.6%, average in Brazil, 4.6%, Chile, 2.4%, Colombia, 3.9%. 2021, 2024, average inflation in Uruguay, 4.6%, 4.7%. So almost 200 basis points lower per year on average, okay? You compare to other countries, Brazil, 4.2%, Chile, 5.5%, Colombia, 7%. So Uruguay has seen a convergence of its inflation to, let's say, regional averages, obviously not including Argentina, Venezuela, okay? And this is very important because I think in here, we need to have continuity. And as you know, we can discuss with more details, but once we have a new administration, they have the ability in order to name the majority of the board, which has a relevance in terms of the monetary policy decisions. Again, major gain on the inflation side should be maintained independently of who wins and reinforced independently of who wins the election. And then productivity. Sometimes as a Uruguayan, I'm always criticizing productivity, but you know what? When properly measured, I'm talking about a recent working paper by the IMF using World Bank data, and when correctly measured by BPP productivity in the industry, in services sector and agriculture, Uruguay is basically topping the charts in the region. A lot of work to do still. Why? Because when you look at the ratio of non-tradable services prices, Uruguay is much more expensive than the region. So we still need to gain a lot in terms of productivity, but there has already been an improvement. Again, it's about continuity profundization or immense, but for better. And last but definitely not least, fiscal institutions. Okay, this administration created a sort of fiscal rule. It has different sort of pillars. I'm not going to go into the details, but this has been an improvement. It needs to be, it needs an evolution. Okay, it needs an evolution because we are seeing, for example, this year the fiscal deficit is basically going to be wider than what the fiscal rule was basically suggesting. So it needs an evolution, and hopefully whoever wins will take those steps. Again, I think Uruguay, to your point, Uruguay has done a lot in the last 25 years, a lot in the last 5 years, and it's about, an evolution is likely required, but an evolution for good, and I think the market will take this as a base case. It's already taking this as a base case for Uruguay, correcting for the risk on the pension levy side that likely I will discuss in the questions.
Yeah, those are really great points. And, it's interesting the way that you framed it. I mean, they've made a lot of progress, meaningful progress, solid progress, continued progress. The question is, is there, what comes next? Is there complacency, perhaps, congratulatory and, we're doing pretty well and better than our peers, et cetera? Or, what are the next steps to get to the next level of growth to build on the progress that's already been made and frankly, not take negative steps that would walk back some of that progress. And we've all talked about pension reform already. But Samar, let's go to you. You look at sovereign risk and, how are you seeing Uruguay from that perspective? It looks pretty good compared to some of its neighbors, but from a global perspective, how are you seeing Uruguay and what could be done to really amplify the upside here that we've been talking about?
Thank you for having me and good morning. It's a pleasure. And thank you for, the organizing the panel that way. So I speak at the end because then we have all the information and the context that we need. So I can, your other guests did a great job just laying the ground. So and I agree with much of what said, I have to say. So and the progress that was made that Diego highlighted on the macro side, on the growth front, and especially on the inflation, were key drivers for the rating upgrade. Just to step back a second, we have now Uruguay at Baa1 with a stable outlook. We upgraded earlier this year in March, and to put this in context, the key drivers for that were actually our, observing that growth dynamics and investment performance really shifted upwards. It improved a lot compared to the pre-pandemic years. So 3.3 versus less than 1% growth is material for Uruguay's credit profile. So that was one area that we expected that to continue going forward. The second was on the fiscal framework and the support from, the introduction of the framework, commitment and compliance with it that will help stabilize debt in line with peers. So we always take a peer comparison, as you mentioned, but just to remind everyone that we value those two features that were key drivers in the rating upgrade. So so going to where we started on the referendum or the plebiscite and in a way reversing the pension reform, I would also say that having approved the pension reform was one of the elements that supported our assessment of fiscal strength going forward. So reversing that will be problematic as well. Particularly because it creates, if it happens, and you never know. Yeah, I know it's most of many, the both presidential candidates and the parties have warned against its implications and all of that. But at the end of the day, you really never know what will happen. So it will be a big distraction. I think key elements is that directly it will add to fiscal spending. The next government, if we want to see continuity on the fiscal consolidation front or maintaining the commitment to the broad fiscal path that is now laid down in the fiscal framework and commitment to that, then compensatory measures will have to be introduced because that's around 1.3% of GDP of additional cost to the government. So that has to come from somewhere, either higher taxes or cutting other spending. So that's one that's one challenge for the next government, strictly speaking, on the fiscal side. But beyond that, remember, we talked about the growth dynamics improving and higher investment, the uncertainty that this is creating now and will continue to create until it is kind of sorted out, I think could have also negative implications for growth and investment, which is something that going forward, if you want to go to the next level, is something that Uruguay would be focused on. How can we get even more FDI in? How can we get even more investment in renewables and growth enhancing investment and productivity enhancing investment in education? That is something that is still in a way a weak link in Uruguay's overall, if you will, policy framework. So these are the areas where you would hope the new government would be focused on. So if this happens, and you have to really reconfigure the pension system and figure out how to pay for it, it will distract from a lot of the other areas that could be more credit positive, if you will, and walk back one of the key reforms that were actually supportive of the fiscal measure. So we take this as a downside scenario, of course, for the country's credit profile. I can go more into the peers and all of that in a second, if you will, but I think I wanted to say this up front for the conversation.
No, I think that's terrific. And I'm going to stay with you, Samar, for just a second and follow up, because we're already getting a bunch of questions in from those online, and we really appreciate their engagement. Samar, the couple of questions have come in about the idea that, Frente Amplio is center left, has a fairly large social agenda. To say nothing of the pension reform, let's put that aside for a minute. That's an exogenous issue, perhaps. But, just implementing some of the promises that Frente Amplio is suggesting, would that materially change some of your projections? Because, Diego's talked about continuity, you've talked about fiscal responsibility, all these things. We're already getting to the question of, well, how do you pay for all these things? Yeah. What are your views on that?
I mean, for Uruguay, with one of the countries, if not the countries, with one of the highest institutional strength from our, from a credit perspective in the region, we do anticipate policy continuity in this context. We do not see major shifts between one government and the other. There may be different emphasis, if you will, but I think our baseline, which is embedded in the upgrade and the positive outlook, is that whether you have a center-right or a center-left government, you will still have broad compliance and commitment to fiscal consolidation and the fiscal path. So if you want to implement some programs, then you will have to either unimplement other things or find or raise revenues to do that. We also note that both announcements on both candidates for the finance minister are supportive of this direction. So, and I will have to say, I know you can, within the country, there is a lot of elections always create, if you will, noise, if nothing else. Compared to other countries, when you have both options, broadly speaking, presenting fiscal, responsibility, that's an encouraging sign. But when you are in a situation where you have to choose, that you have always limited options. So if you implement certain promises, then, as I say, you have to make choices as to where to allocate resources, or you will raise more taxes. I mean, Uruguay has a, if you will, for lack of a better term, a welfare state model. It's more like a Southern European country in that sense. That's a model that the country chose. It has value in terms of social stability. It has value in political and institutional stability, but it also has costs that have to be managed. So strictly speaking, whether the government makes those promises and fulfills them, the question is how they fulfill them and what are the fiscal implications for that. In the context of keeping investment going, providing the policy environment that has regulatory certainty and all of that, is another downside to suddenly changing your pension system. It creates uncertainty around that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. No, and I think the idea that, you have, broadly speaking, the candidates, agree on the general direction anyway, that's a good thing. Maybe in politics, Nick, being boring isn't necessarily the best thing, but in financial markets, maybe it's a good thing, at least in this context. Samar, those were really great comments. Thank you. And I want to come back to Nick and focus on the candidate we haven't talked a lot about, but a question has come in, and I think it's a really good question, is, if Ojeda got to the second round or indeed got elected, he's kind of, you called him the Black Swan event. This is something that a lot of people haven't focused on. Can you give us a sense of who he is and what he might be all about?
Yeah, sure. So he's the youngest presidential candidate in the race. He's very seen as a very vibrant voice in the campaign. He has a very strong media presence. His policies are not substantially that different than Delgado's policies. It's more a difference in degree than in kind. He certainly does focus a lot more on issues like crime. The Partido Colorado has a lot more emphasis on a tough on crime agenda. He's certainly, I would say, more vocal in his views, certainly on issues like Venezuela, Cuba. So he would be akin in terms of his style and temperament to Lacache, actually. And they actually are seen together a lot. So I think a lot of people are beginning to make this connection between the two of them, of these young, vibrant candidates. So, but in terms of policies, I don't think there's that much daylight between them, really. I mean, again, it's just an issue of degree. It's a more issue of style, I would say. And Ojeda certainly is much more of an attack dog. He certainly has a lot more vicious positions against the Frente Amplio than Delgado. Delgado is seen as more as a compromise candidate, more professional in the sense that he's more willing to negotiate and more tempered in his views. Ojeda is this new energy. So again, I think with Ojeda, he's more of a difference in how to approach politics than the actual content. That being said, if he does make it to the second round, which is no longer a remote possibility, I think it's possible. It's possible, not probable, but it can happen. It would, like I said, change the tenor of the debate, and I think it would actually potentially throw Orsi off a little bit because the expectation is always Delgado versus Orsi. That's kind of the expectation. If Ojeda comes in, it will throw off the narrative, and Orsi will have to rejig his perspective, his narratives, and also potentially his policies. And one of the things that I'm worried about for Orsi actually is that his party hasn't been that explicit as to what their policy preferences are so far. And the reason, and when it comes to Ojeda or Delgado, everyone knows it's continuity. Like no one thinks that there's going to be massive changes. With Orsi, it's a question of how much change. Although you're right, Uruguayan politics can be boring. It's not like there's no change, right? And so the question is, Orsi is still not being very explicit as to what his policy preferences are. And the reason why I think that's a problem is because he's not stress testing his policies. And so if you're not stress testing them and you go into the second round and you propose your policies and they're not popular or they're not well received, you don't have much time to rejig your policies or your messaging. And that could open up the door for somebody like Ojeda, who's very energetic, who's very social media savvy, to really dominate the news cycle. So that's going to be a very interesting second round. It would totally, like I said, upend expectations. And if the plebiscite is rejected, I just want to go back to the plebiscite. My view is that even if it is rejected, which I think is the baseline view, that doesn't mean that pensions aren't going to dominate politics in the next few years. I think the issue has been retabled. And I think the next government will still have to deal with the question of, well, how to deal with pension reform in the future. There might have to be some amendments. There might have to be some changes. It won't be a Brexit level event, but nevertheless, I think it will still take up a lot of bandwidth for the next government. And so I think when it comes to, just briefly also, finally, when it comes to the question of fiscal continuity, I think that is the intention. I think certainly Labat, who is the candidate for the Partido Nacional in terms of the Minister of Economy, and Gabriel Odone, both of them are very highly competent, highly respected economists. And Odone has actually gone so far as to say that he wants a 2% of GDP primary surplus by the end of the term. No one knows how he's going to do that. The reason, the reason why is because Uruguay's spending has a very low level of discretion. It's a lot of spending that is just constitutionally mandated or is indexed and is automatic. So where are these savings going to come from? Well, the savings are either going to come from reducing the size of the state or by raising taxes. And the problem that the Frente Amplio faces is that they've already indicated that they're open to the idea of raising taxes, but they're also open to the idea of spending more. So how much of that increase in tax revenue is going to be offset by increased spending? So that's kind of the bigger problem when it comes to the expectations of the Frente Amplio's fiscal agenda. The government, the Partido Nacional Delgado, says he's not going to raise taxes, but he's also going to pursue a reduction of the size of the state and find efficiencies. So that's what I'm saying. When it comes to the Frente Amplio's policies on these issues, the intentions are in the right place. It's just more, well, okay, but how are you actually going to do that? I think that's the bigger question.
Diego, I'm going to come to you in just a second, but sticking with Nick, I want to probe a point that you teased a little bit. You're talking about Orsi not being necessarily overly transparent in terms of some of his policy agenda, that he may get smoked out in the second round if it's, depending on how that goes, which I think is a really interesting point. Do you see any risk that in not being explicit to this point in terms of some of his policy agenda, that he might actually not be the, centrist that people are talking about, and maybe there's more a stronger leftist agenda there, or is that not really something that you're concerned about?
I'm not concerned of him being
Yeah.
a radical leftist in any way. I don't think he is. I think he's
Right.
a center left. The bigger problem actually will be within the Congress and the size of far left factions inside the Congress and the Frente Amplio. That's something to pay very close attention to. So it's not entirely clear if the Frente Amplio can reach majority or not. So that would matter a lot. And another thing I would point out is that the polls are beginning to suggest that smaller parties, even fringe parties, are potentially going to make it into Congress. That could really complicate coalition building, especially if the Frente Amplio or the government, that is, fail to reach majority status. You might have to make some uncomfortable compromises when it comes to actually passing laws. So I think keeping a close eye on Congress as well is extremely important, and that will be decided on the 27th. So that will also, I think, play into the tenor of the second round campaign. How are you going to, make agreements with parties that otherwise are going to demand some things that are more like single issue or even fringe things that otherwise you didn't have to consider before. So there's a lot of variables are going to start going into the second round debates, and it will be interesting to see how somebody like Orsi, who doesn't really have that experience, how he's going to articulate a way to construct a governing coalition in Congress.
And I think that's a great point. That's why I wanted to ask the question as directly as I did, because it smokes out, kind of what are some of the other indicators here that don't often get discussed in forums like this. It's almost like, obviously there are differences, but there are similarities anyway to what Boric did in Chile, right? In terms of the coalition he had to bring together and some of the people that are part of the government, et cetera. Interesting points, really good. Thanks for that. We're going to go to you, Diego. I want to ask a question that builds on what we've all been saying, what you've all been saying, but put it in the international context, right? Uruguay is a price taker, a small country, financially, economically. The world is a big place, and there are a lot of trends and issues going on globally. What are some of the global risks that you see for Uruguay in the context of going forward, perhaps in terms of its international engagement profile on trade, on international investment? Samar talked about, the need to increase FDI. Where does Uruguay fit into some of those conversations?
Yeah, no, sure. But before going into that, I want to make, at least on a personal level, I want to clarify, to get a point straight from my side. I would not compare Orsi to Boric at all. The Boric coalition that was put in place, they were basically signing with the constitutional convention back in the day, entered into administration basically promising the refundation of the country. President Boric has indeed managed throughout his term to move towards moderate positions, baby steps, depends on how you assess it, but he has definitely not polarized and has continued to negotiate. I don't think comparing current Frente Amplio and Orsi to Boric and his coalition when he got into power is a fair point. Second point, we are all maybe discussing too much about a plebiscite which by now no poll suggests it's going to be approved, and maybe not putting the real emphasis when transmitting the message on the relevance of, for example, having the majority in the Congress, in particular in the Senate, because the electoral system in Uruguay basically gives an advantage to the parties that are most voted in order to define the marginal benches and seats. So that's very important, and to the ability to put in place, coalitions that endure in time. Okay, so that I think Nicolás' point on that front was very true, very important. And I will again repeat, there is by now no poll showing approval above 50% plus one of debated votes going into the election. This is not a referendum, this is a plebiscite. In here, you don't have two options, yes and no. You only have one option, which is yes. And you need to put the paper ballot within the envelope to cast a vote that will be counted in favor of the constitutional reform. Okay, so that's a very important point, because most of the sectors of the different political parties are not going to include that paper ballot within the envelope. We Uruguayans, we are a little bit lazy sometimes, no? And when preparing to go to the vote stations, we like to go around, receive the envelope already prepared with the lists for the Senate, for the deputies, and we side with some plebiscite also included. We are a little bit lazy in terms of getting into the room and including a paper in a ballot. We already want to get to the polls with the job done. So again, I would personally believe a huge, and the last point, if you have all the presidential candidates basically telling you, I'm not siding with this idea, and you have a country in which the aversion to the political system is not as high as in other countries in the region, then it's very unlikely. Why, if I'm choosing X, B, or A for president, why I'm going to do something that these guys are telling me they will severely undermine their ability to do as they are promising? So again, I don't think this is going to improve, but this has had an effect on markets. Now, going to your question, I'm going to be, but sorry for that, but I needed to make these points, I think, clear, in particular for those who are not sitting in Uruguay, not following the country that closely. External relations, well, Uruguay has always been a country siding with, let's say, Western Hemisphere ideas, for example, when voting in the United Nations, okay? And we have seen, I think Uruguay has been the country that most regularly has voted with the US in terms of UN resolutions, okay? Even during the administration of former President Mujica, okay? So that's point number one. Point number two, we do have a tremendous problem when it comes to trade integration, and not because of Uruguay, because we are basically, in this institution called Mercosur that has been basically dedicated to destroy trade rather than create trade. And this is proper names because of Brazil and because of Argentina. The current Argentine administration seems to be siding with the ideas of, looking for bilateral trade agreements, looking for opportunities, move ahead in a more decidedly manner. And but we need to see if the option winning Uruguay aims to walk this path or prefers to go a little bit more on the protective side and getting, more in better terms with the Brazilian administration and under Lula. So I think the risk in here is, if Frente Amplio wins, I think this push for bilateral trade agreements maybe is not that, it's not an option that will be in line with investment of political capital. And while we have continuity, meaning the incumbent winning, I think we are going to continue seeing that with a higher likelihood of success, if, of course, global geopolitical fragmentation allows. And that's the other risk in here. Uruguay is a commodity exporter country when it comes to merchandise. Services is different, but merchandise is a commodity exporter, and therefore, if we have a regime change in the US in terms of, for example, higher tariffs and lower commodity prices, well, we're going to have an impact. Last but not least, FDI. It's tough to maintain the levels of FDI that Uruguay has seen in the last 4 or 5 years. When I refer to a particular CAPEX project that actually have allowed the country to grow 1 point of GDP, let's say, on average in the last 4 years, that has been associated to CapEx. There are a number of projects that this administration has negotiated and that will pan out in the coming administration, continuity. And but still, I mean, the country has a very limited local market, a domestic market. So it's all about integration. And for that, hopefully we'll do as much as possible in order to set bridges with Europe, with China, whoever. But the region matters. Argentina is offering an opportunity for smaller countries as Uruguay. Brazil is usually reluctant. We'll see which is the flavor of the administration in office starting March next year.
Yeah, good stuff. Thank you. And I think, from my personal perspective, the international trade profile is an area of opportunity for a country like Uruguay, and frankly, a necessity to really approach aggressively on a national basis, not a political basis. Thanks for that, Diego. Really well done. Samar, coming back to you. Diego just mentioned the C word, China. This is a question that's come up several times already in the chat, and well, let's raise it among ourselves. What's Uruguay's current relationship with China, and where do you anticipate that heading?
You mean with, I think, Uruguay has been vocal about trying to have a bilateral trade agreement and all of that, but I think Diego presented the trade-offs very well. Much of the Mercosur is now thinking more as a bloc, let's say, Brazil, of course, and Paraguay is there. Argentina is always complicated, and then so I think it would seem still that Uruguay would be a bit of a alone in going as going it alone, as it were, as a bilateral trade agreement. So from a credit perspective, as you say, having more trade, more investment, more access to global market would be a credit positive, as we call it. I mean, as a small open economy, that's an important growth driver. Uruguay also has opportunities in attracting investment in renewable energy, in which is some of the regions in general has this opportunity. I think Brazil is the biggest one, obviously, but Chile has been benefiting from that potential, and the smaller countries in the region, Uruguay, Paraguay, also have a huge opportunity for power shoring, as it's termed sometimes. So these are growth opportunities, and China has been very active in investing in these renewable energy opportunities in the region. I think the interesting aspect of the U.S. elections is that how, if you will, the geopolitical tensions between the U.S. and China impact those investments. I think by and large, our view is that whether it's whoever wins in the U.S. Now we're talking about the U.S. election, not the Uruguayan elections. The trade relations will continue to be complicated. I think under a Trump administration, it will be more stark, if you will. If you have a blanket tariffs, that's more damaging to global trade. It's more damaging to inflation prospects and inflation dynamics in the U.S. Complicates monetary policy decisions here in the U.S. with implications for the world. But now we're talking about Latin America, so that's maybe one path that is more complicated to handle than, if you will, more targeted trade policies and protecting U.S. interests, and maybe trying to build more constructive relationships with Latin America to safeguard U.S. national interests on the trade front. So you don't have a different, if you will, strategic goal, but you have maybe better or worse tools to manage that. So within all of that, I think that the chips will fall where they may, in a way, if you will, for each country. And the other area that is relevant for the region is on immigration, but Uruguay and other countries in the southern hemisphere, in that part of Latin America, are less impacted by that.
Yeah.
So that's what I would say. I mean, opportunities are there, I think, for sure, but sometimes politics and political economy make it difficult to capitalize.
One quick question, and then we'll go to your wrap-up comments, because our time is beginning to grow a little bit short. A question has come in on the chat in terms of, and it's relevant to the relationship with China, the illegal fishing activities that have happened off the coast of South America and Uruguay's response to that. I open the question to any of you who would care to respond, if any of you would, but do you see that, where do you see that heading in terms of the new Uruguayan government? Is that going to continue to be a flashpoint, a concern, an issue, or is that something that will resolve itself diplomatically or some other means? Anybody care to address that? No particular.
Not familiar on my side with the microeconomics or the fishing sector.
Okay. All right. Well, with that, let's offer to each of you the opportunity to make some concluding comments. We'll start in reverse order. We'll go to Samar first. And look, you can, if you care to react or respond to anything that's been said, or add something new in the context of what is the final word that you want to leave us with going into the elections on October 27th in Uruguay. So again, thanks to each of you for your wonderful comments and give you the chance to offer your concluding thoughts. Samar, to you.
Okay, thank you, Eric. I mean, for us, we value a lot policy continuity. Sometimes it's slow to make changes, but that's part of the process, the Uruguayan way, if you will. So, you know, taking it from that perspective, I think I see a strong disruption or a strong departure from something that has already been agreed upon, negotiated, discussed over time, which we know everything takes time to implement. The assumption is that then it doesn't get reversed. So I think to Diego's point, maybe it's not going to happen, but I think it's taking, that's where the surprise comes in, or that's where the nervousness comes in. So yeah, I guess it's good to have the baseline scenario that will not be approved, but you cannot discount the possibility 100%, right?
Diego, to you.
On my side, and again, I mean, centering on the central scenario, I think it's about policy decisions, and I think when I think about continuity, I'm basically on the macroeconomic front, on the market front. I think it's very important for whoever wins to maintain the monetary and fiscal institutions that were created in the past 5 years, and to respect that, and if possible, to evolve for good, for better. On the monetary side, to have Uruguay's inflation not that deviated from the rest of the world means less of a real appreciation of the currency, and that both very important goes in hand with the potential growth ability of the economy. So that's very important. And the second point I'd like to make, and this goes basically for all the countries in the emerging space and obviously developed too, but debt to GDP, gross debt is much higher now than 5 years ago. Okay, so even with the fiscal institutions that were created, the fiscal rule, the 3 pillars, so on and so forth, I mean, gross debt is basically second quarter 24 for close to $48 billion. It was $30 billion in 2019. Again, it happened to all countries because of the COVID, more in debt, and so on and so forth. But that also means that potential fiscal space is even more limited than we were thinking 5 years ago, when the institutions, the fiscal institutions that were created, were entertained and eventually deployed. So fiscal order is paramount to the ability of the country to be able to grow, to the ability of the country to be able to redistribute, to the ability of the country to increase its social welfare, which is keystone of the Uruguayan social contract. If someone doesn't understand this properly, the market will likely punish Uruguay. Despite that, in gross terms being much higher, Uruguay is basically paying more or less the same rate on average in order to roll over the debt as 5 years ago. Any deviation on the fiscal front or on the monetary front, I would add, will severely penalize Uruguay by having much higher financial costs, and that would quickly have an effect on potential growth. This is my last message. Continuity, yes, And always, when I speak, and we all speak, we are always having in mind, neighbors in the region in general, the relative stance of Uruguay. But when it comes to the story of Uruguay on its own, very important to bear in mind that fiscal space is even more restricted now than what was 5 years ago.
Yeah, really important points where policy is being disciplined by the market based on the implications of what certain policy changes could imply. Diego, terrific. Well done. Let's go to you for final thoughts, Nick.
Thanks. Great conversation. So Uruguay is known for its policy stability and political stability. And I think what we shouldn't do is take that for granted. And this election does suggest that there are ominous signs or worrying signs that this much vaunted stability is under stress. The plebiscite, although it's unlikely to pass, but at the same time, many elections recently we've seen unlikely to pass and they pass. So let's not be benign. That's the first thing, is that we're in for potential surprises. The second thing I would say is that what we're seeing is, I think, a very concerning disjuncture between the political elites and what's happening on the ground. So it's true that you have all the presidential candidates who are against the plebiscite, but the fact that you have almost half the population defying their political leaders is of a concern. And it does suggest that there's a growing weakness between the ties of the party and the base that should be of increasing concern for observers and Uruguayans themselves. The other thing I would say is that there's increasing political fragmentation in Uruguay. You have a number of smaller parties that are beginning to emerge that have come outside of the traditional Overton window of the left-right that Uruguay usually has, which is something that we have to pay close attention to, because the emergence of social media, the emergence of all these new forms of interaction between elites and voters is challenging the traditional role parties play. And Uruguay often sees itself as a party-based democracy, and that could be weakening as well over time. So although my view currently is that Uruguay is still by far the most stable democracy in Latin America, that doesn't always have to be the case. It doesn't always have to be the case. And like I said, when I was talking about crime, if Uruguay doesn't deal with the problem of crime and education in a concerted way, there's a serious threat here of an emergence of a populism in the country that we have to pay very close attention to. So still positive, still optimistic about Uruguay, but let's also keep in mind that risks are increasing for the country's democracy as well.
Well, it's a great rejoinder, and the fact of the matter is you could probably make the same case for most of the countries in the Western Hemisphere, certainly our own here in the US, but what a terrific conversation. Lots of agreement, some disagreement, and that's just the way that I as a moderator like to see it, because it keeps things interesting. This was not a boring conversation. It was a very interesting one, and I just want to thank each of you for joining us, and I hope you'll come back to another session at some point with the council. We'd be delighted to host you. And I want to thank all of the viewers who have been with us for the past hour as well. Trust that it was not just meaningful, but also interesting and enjoyable for you. We'll be watching these issues very carefully as events move forward in Uruguay. Join us at the Council of the Americas in Washington, New York, Miami, or throughout the hemisphere in the coming months and throughout the next year. We'd be delighted to see you again in person. With that, we will close our event and look forward to seeing each of you the next time. So long from Washington.
Bye.